talking about last week, which was the book of Jude, and in particular we were looking at the passage in 2 John that has some parallels, or is talking about some of the same things that Jude is, in terms of the Gnostics who are teaching that Jesus has not come in the flesh, or alternatively that Jesus is not God. In this case, it looks like he was more speaking to those who did not believe that he had actually been physically incarnate, that he had only been spiritually incarnate. And so John says that there's deceivers who've gone out into the world. They do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. This is the deceiver, the Antichrist. Watch yourselves that you do not lose what you have accomplished, that you may receive a full reward. Anyone who goes too far and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. The one who abides in the teachings, he has both the Father and the Son. So John is talking to some people who have decided that there is more to Christianity than what was taught to them, and that they're the ones who are the arbitrators of who is going to get to be in on this new knowledge. And he says you don't need to go too far and go beyond what you've actually been taught, beyond what the Word actually says, particularly when it comes to the nature of Christ and to the kind of behavior that's expected of Christians. He continues and says, if anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house, do not give him a greeting, for the one who gives him a greeting participates in his evil deeds. We talked last week about the idea that this is the danger of associating with people who call themselves Christians but are not behaving like Christians, who call themselves, who try to identify themselves as being teachers, but who are not really teachers. And the danger here, and this is something we don't often think of today, in terms of receiving somebody into our house, is actually that you're giving them a platform in which to stay and perhaps even teach out of. Because remember, most of the churches during this period of time met in houses, so welcoming that person into your house may very well have meant welcoming them in and giving them a place to teach. But more broadly, bringing them into your house and fellowshipping with them and having a relationship with them that would suggest to other Christians that you are okay with what they're teaching, that you are supporting what they're teaching. Now this gives us, and I know we had a little bit of discussion about this last week, about this can kind of create some problems or some confusion when it comes to people we might be trying to convert. And obviously when we're talking about the world, I don't think this really applies, because it's pretty easy to say the same thing Jesus did. Look, I'm here to seek and save the lost. Talking to people who are not even in a church, not claiming that they have a special teaching for Christ. They don't even believe in Christ. It's trickier when we start talking about how we relate to other people from other Christian denominations who we are trying to show the way, that there is something more or better or something like that. And while I don't think that we necessarily have to look at every single person who's a part of a church that's not the Church of Christ as a conversion opportunity, because in many cases they believe the things that are really important anyway, and perhaps they're not the place we need to focus our energy, even if we might want to bring them into the Church of Christ. Nevertheless, there are times when we might choose to sit down with and fellowship with someone who believes a lot of the same things we do, but doesn't believe some of the things that we think are critical. Doesn't believe in baptism, doesn't believe in the divinity of Christ, or some of those kinds of things. And there I think we need to be careful, but I think it's also defensible, because it's important to realize that here John is talking about a situation where the people in the church might have a hard time distinguishing between what's true and what's not true because of what's being taught. And the one big advantage that we do have over most of the people, even during John's era, is what? What do we have that they lacked? We have the written word. Now, by John's time, some of those gospels and some of those letters that Paul and others had written have begun to circulate through the churches. So not only are the local churches that he wrote them to accessing them, but occasionally, but they're moving beyond some of those initial churches. But still, there are a lot of congregations that would not have information about the specifics of Jesus' background. And they might have heard it second or third hand from a second or third generation Christian. Here's what John told me, or here's what I heard from Apollos, who learned it from Paul, or whatever. And so when I say this is what I heard, what's the easy response to say if you want to teach something that's false?
who you heard it from may not be correct.
Well, or even if you did, I heard it from somebody else and it was different, you know, or I got it directly from God and it was different. And because the churches weren't getting direct revelation from God, one of the miraculous gifts that's given in a couple of places is the gift of knowledge. So the idea that people sometimes just got divine inspiration, which would make sense in a context where people were not always sure what the actual facts were, having someone who could say, that's not true. You know, how would you like to have that person in your church? The guy who actually knows exactly what's right. He may not know what's the correct answer is in the sense of being able to tell you, but he can always tell you whether it's right or wrong, you know. So you're in the middle of a sermon and say, yeah, that's wrong, you know. All right, what do we do now? You know, so the spirit of knowledge existed, but if somebody comes and says, I know this, God told me this, and you're saying, well, I heard it third hand through Paul, suddenly authority isn't nearly as clear as it would be now. But now, when the question is, well, is what you're teaching true or is what you're teaching true? The answer is real simple. What does it say? You know, and if what this says doesn't line up with what you're saying, then we know that there's a problem.
So that's why we had miracles and the laying on of hands and some gift of knowledge. But you know, you can also use the example of Peter, who didn't understand.
Right.
So it's very possible that people, even with the knowledge or with the gifts, got it wrong.
Yes.
Through their own prejudice.
Yes, and or their own assumptions, or you know, and in the case of Peter, it's kind of ironic because here's Peter's clearly inspired at times, given direct revelations at times, but in that case, either he was ignoring the revelation, and to some extent that's certainly true, or he was simply not, he hadn't been sold on something specific right then and there. God wasn't saying, Peter, go fellowship with the Gentiles, you know. So he misapplied what he knew. And that is always a danger, but in terms of our comfort level, in terms of sitting down and talking to someone who doesn't believe exactly the same things we do, but in general put themselves out as a Christian, should be a lot higher since we have the Word to go on. And since we could go in and say, okay, let's look at what it says and try to understand it. And so since we can compare what it says to what we think we know, we're in a better place to have those conversations without the risk of bias or without the risk of giving someone a platform. You know, if you sit down and talk to someone who is a Catholic, for example, to use someone, a group that certainly claims to be Christian, it's unlikely that the church afterwards is going to come to you and say, I can't believe you said, I'm going to talk to that Catholic guy. You know, how are we supposed to know whether what they say is true or what you say is true? Well, obviously we can look at this and we can all calm down and just, you know, move on. You know, so it does help us to, I think, lift some of that veil of confusion that might otherwise be there, and makes it more possible for us to associate with someone, as long as, again, there's a big difference between associating with someone for the purpose of trying to convert them versus associating with someone as though they were a member of the church in every way. And I think we can see that distinction as well in terms of how we interact with people. We don't invite someone who is from another denomination, and particularly one that would be significantly different from ours, to come and preach or talk to us or something about something. So we're very careful about that, even in the context of bringing in someone who's working, say, with a mission or something, someone who's working with a children's home or some kind of thing like that. We're very cautious about bringing someone like that in to let them speak to us. If they want to come and join us for worship or class or whatever and participate, that's certainly okay. But to put them in a position where they can say what they want to, we're pretty cautious about that. So, and rightly so. So we have to be careful about who we give authority to, who we give the stamp of approval to, even if we don't necessarily intend it. But when you say, I'm endorsing this person, or you can trust this person, or you know, whatever, we're telling people, you know me, and because you know me, you can know that they're okay too. And so we should be very cautious when we do that under any circumstances, because that can come back and bite us if we're not careful. If nothing else, it can diminish our standing in the eyes of others if that person doesn't live up to what we've said they can be. Okay, so let's shift over a little bit and talk more about this licentiousness side of things that both Jude and John are talking, or Peter, I think, we're talking about. This licentiousness problem that they're talking about, which is one of the avenues of Gnosticism, probably the one that was more common during this period of time. The other one, what's it called, asceticism, will become more prominent later on. But the licentiousness side of one is the one that says, well, since the body is different from the spirit, and the body's evil and the spirit's good, then I can just let the body do whatever it wants to because my spirit is good. And so you can, overeat, or you can indulge in sexual immorality, or you can, be drugs or alcohol or whatever it might be. You can do whatever it is because it's just your body, it's not your spirit. And Paul says that's not the right way to think about it. He says just because of grace and the existence of grace doesn't mean you can do whatever you want to. He says all things are lawful for me. This is in 1 Corinthians 6. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. In other words, not all things are good for me. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. Food is for the stomach, and the stomach for food. That is a Gnostic, or the saying of a sensualist, someone who is focused on their senses and what they enjoy. Food is for the stomach, and the stomach is for food, but God will do away with both of them. Yet the body is not for immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord is for the body. Now God has not only raised the Lord, but will also raise us up through his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Now, in the context of 1 Corinthians, he's not talking to people who are struggling with the Gnostic thing. He's talking to Corinthians who have misunderstood the role of grace, and they have decided that grace means you can do whatever you want to because you're free from sin, and therefore you are constantly free from sin, therefore you don't have to worry about it. And Paul says, you've misunderstood. You're right that the law of Moses has been lifted off. And so you don't have to worry about all those restrictions. And so the rules of the law of Moses about what you can eat and when you can eat it, and when you've got to sacrifice and things like that, those things have gone away. But that doesn't mean you can just and should just do whatever you want to. Because if you just do whatever you want to, you are corrupting not only yourself, but who? Well, through the Spirit, you're corrupting the body of Christ, because he says we're members of the body of Christ. And you can't do anything to part of your body that doesn't ultimately affect all your body. You inject something into your hand, it's gradually going to work its way through your system. You get a cancer in a part of your body, it's going to gradually metastasize and work its way through your body if it's left unchecked, if it doesn't kill you first. Anything that affects part of us affects all of us in one way or another, even if it's simply that now I no longer have the use of my hand, and that's a debilitating thing to have happen. So when we are bringing things into ourselves that hurt us, they don't just hurt us. And this is a really important principle that for a long time, I'll always say it this way, for a long time there has been arguments like the idea that the use of drugs is a victimless crime. That you're just doing it to yourself, you're not hurting anybody else. Pornography is a victimless sin. Lots of things like that. It's just you. You're just doing it to yourself. And more, even the more liberal-minded social scientists have to acknowledge that that's just not true. That every crime and every sin, well, maybe they would say it was sin, but every criminal action ultimately does affect other people. Because when I use drugs, the consequences are not just mine. They are usually visited upon my family. They are frequently visited upon our society in terms of having to care for me because I'm not able to care for myself, in terms of other criminal offenses that I commit in trying to satisfy my drug habit, things like that. And when we think about the kinds of sins that would seem to be internal, I'm not doing anything that anybody else knows about. It doesn't change the fact that those things that I do impact other people because they change me and they change how I interact with those people. Whether it is, drinking too much on the weekend, and because of that I am less capable when it comes to worship, or I'm less capable or less present when I'm in worship or when I'm associating with my friends. Whether it is something like pornography that damages relationships, even if you're not married, with other people. Whether it's, whatever it might be, these kinds of sins, they are not simply internal to me. And we can't pretend that they are. They change the way that we think, they change the way that we act, and because of that, they impact other people as well. And so we are members of the body of Christ, and when we do things that would seem to just affect us, ultimately they do affect other people as well. And so, more broadly, Paul says, the body is for the Lord and the Lord is for the body. Our body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. And the Spirit lives in us, and so for that purpose, that reason, our body lives to God. It exists to serve God. Elsewhere, Paul will say that our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, that we are places of worship for the Holy Spirit. And so, just as, you didn't go into the temple, certainly you wouldn't go into the temple and behave in a way that was unbecoming. And today, a lot of times in many churches, we're very concerned what happens in the building, because that's where we worship. Well, I don't worry so much about the building, because that's not the important thing. I do worry about the body, because our bodies are what we worship with and who we worship through, because of the Spirit that's in us. And so how we treat our bodies and what we do with them matters, because they belong to God and because the Spirit is living in us. And what we do, and if nothing else, it makes the Spirit real sad if we're doing things that we ought not be doing while it's dwelling in us. So Paul is dealing with this problem in a different way long before John and Peter and others will have to deal with it in terms of Gnosticism. But it comes from the same basic place, which is humanity likes to do what it wants to do, and we come up with excuses for it. Whether it's this approach, grace is taking care of it for me, or whether it's the Gnostic approach, the body and the Spirit are different, or whether it's the approach of the more modern approach of that was just it was a cultural thing. They couldn't do that because it was a cultural thing. Well, if you understand the Greek and Roman culture, you know that culture thought pretty much everything was okay, as long as you did it in some degree of moderation. And so to say that Christians were in a culture that was much more conservative than ours is actually not very accurate. They were in a culture that in most ways was just about as liberal as ours is, and yet they're saying don't do these kinds of things. Be different from these kinds of things, not just because the society around you is going to look bad at you, because they don't care, because God wants something better. So we do have this human tendency to find ways to get away with the things we want to do, but Paul and others keep shooting them down to make sure we understand that that's not what we want. Okay, thoughts, comments, anything like that? All right, let me move on to the next piece of Jude. Jude says, "Now I desire to remind you, though you know all things once for all." What is that about? Is he being sarcastic, or does he mean that?
Well, obviously he's taught them something.
Okay.
That's he just is reminding them of what they already should know.
And why is that important in the context of what we've been talking about?
Because what they had from Paul or from Jude probably, or was from the Scripture.
Okay.
I mean, it was the basis, and should have been the basis for their action.
Okay. So he's saying you know all the stuff you need to know. Again, this is a dig against the Gnostics, because they're saying you don't know everything you need to know. You don't know all the truths. There's some special truths that are reserved. And so Jude is actually saying this, not sarcastically. Now, in Corinthians, Paul will actually say something very similar. I wanted to tell you, although you already know everything, obviously, there he's being sarcastic. I mean, he really is being sarcastic. He's like, you guys are just a bunch of idiots, but you think you know everything. But in this case, Jude is actually saying to them, you do know. You have the information you need. There's nothing you're missing. But I want to remind you. So it's not that you don't know. It's that I just want to. What is it we say when I witness on the stand? Would it help you to refresh your recollection if I let you refer to your police report? Yes, it would. Okay, so I want to refresh your recollection that the Lord, after saving the people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe. This is an important truth for us to remember, and this speaks, to that whole once saved, always saved concept. This is one of the most direct daggers against that concept that we can ever come across in the Scriptures. He says, the Israelites were saved out of the land of Egypt. He rescued them from slavery, from bondage, and he brought them out into this good land. And then later on, he destroyed almost all of them. And by the time Jude writes this, is probably around the time, maybe a little before the temple is going to be, Jerusalem is going to be razed to the ground by the Romans for good. But by this time, certainly there's been the Israelites, the vast majority of the people of Israel went into captivity under the Assyrians, and they just disappeared. They were scattered. And the people in Judea, the tribe of Judah, was taken into captivity by Babylon, came back in a much smaller and less powerful form. And so what he's saying is not all of them were destroyed, but a lot of them were. Most of them were, because they didn't believe, because they didn't do what God wanted them to. So if that's true for them, then that's true for you too. Just because you've been saved, just because you've been called and chosen and the Holy Spirit indwelled you, doesn't mean that you should assume that you can do whatever you want to without consequence. he goes on, he says, now this is where things start to get a little problematic for us, because he starts talking about some stuff that we don't know anything about. And angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, he has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they are in the same way as these who indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh, are exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. If he had just started off with Sodom and Gomorrah there, this would be so much easier. This would create so much less confusion, because that would be easy. You know, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, you'd be like, all right, yeah, I totally know about Sodom and Gomorrah. I know what they're talking about with them. I know what they mean when it says they engaged in gross immorality, went after strange flesh. They're talking about homosexuality, almost certainly there. That would all be fine for us. We get really confused and excited by the first part in verse 6, where it talks about angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, now kept in eternal bonds under darkness for judgment. And we don't know what exactly that means. And when we don't know what something means in the Bible, what happens?
We make it up.
We do. That is exactly correct. We make some stuff up. And we start coming up with theories. Now, there's nothing wrong, I don't think, with coming up with high theories and ideas about what it might mean. Because that's human nature, and speculation is fun, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There's two places where this turns into a problem. The first is when we turn it into a doctrine and start teaching it as though we did know it. And the second is where it becomes the thing that consumes our focus. And you can certainly see in some religions and groups where this has become something that becomes part of the doctrine, what this means and how it should be defined. And they use the idea of the angels not keeping their own domain to modify some of the later terms, gross immorality and strange flesh. In particular, what you'll get is people who will teach that there were relationships going on between angels and human women, or between the humans of Sodom and Gomorrah and these angels, and that's what it means when they went after strange flesh. That becomes one of the doctrinal teachings of some groups.
Question. Verse 6. Angels is often a very convenient word to just denote a messenger of sorts. So, could his have just been people?
Probably not in this case, because the term there is uniformly translated as angels. The term that's used that can mean angels or messengers, it generally relies on what's around it to tell you what it means. And in this case, the fact that it actually uses angels, and I've never seen a single translation that doesn't translate it as angels. It almost certainly is, but what it means is much more complicated or much more challenging. Steve?
So a different writer in 2 Peter refers to, in chapter 2, verse 4 says, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned,
Yeah.
but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment." So to me that seems like what Jude's talking about.
Yeah. And Peter will go on to say, and did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others. Here again, what happens is that people start to say, okay, so these angels sinned, and then they start saying, well, back at the time of Noah, there's the Nephilim. Nephilim are these heroes of old, or they're the sons of the heroes of old, these ancient giants among men. And they say, well, that's how they became giants, is it was his angels who made it with human women. And there is the discussion of the sons of God that they married with the women, not mortal women. That's not the term. I forget the term right off the top of my head. But so again, what happens is, because in both Peter and Jude there's an association between something happening that seems like it's a violation of the natural order in some way, then people leap to this conclusion. It must mean this is true. It must mean that angels were interacting or were mating with humans, and the result was these, what we would think of as demigods or demi-angels, I guess, to use modify the term that's used with the Greek gods. And I don't want to say that that's impossible, because I don't know. I don't actually know what happened. I think that is not a necessary conclusion, and I'm certainly not going to be willing to bind that conclusion on somebody that doesn't agree with it. Because there's a lot of other possible conclusions here, and one of the ones that we definitely know from Revelation, where it's much more clearly explicit, is that there was war in heaven. And Satan and his angels made war against Michael and the rest of the angels of God. And ultimately, who lost?
The dragon.
The dragon. He was thrown down along with his angels into the lake of fire. But we also know that Satan is alive and acting and is still working, and that he works in some cases through demonic entities. In Daniel, we encounter a story where Daniel is told by an angel who comes to him that he was contending with the prince of Persia for a period of time, and because of that was prevented by coming to Daniel, which suggests some sort of spiritual warfare between the angel and some kind of demonic force. We know that there was demon possessions in Jesus' time, and that he actually, on a couple of occasions, directly interacted with demons who were possessing people, or possessing, in a couple of cases, demons who were possessing people. So we don't know that. This gets into an area that I don't want to get too far down the road of, because it's like a sinkhole. You just get further and further sucked into it. But what exactly demons are and where they came from is not made explicitly clear in the scriptures. Many people and most people would probably say they're fallen angels, but we don't know that for sure. But what is definitely clear is that angels can fall. They can rebel against God for some reason or the other, whatever it was that they did. And once they do, they have left their role. Their role is to be a messenger, to be a servant to God. And if you stop doing that, it would be entirely accurate to use the phrase that they abandoned their proper abode. They left their job or their duties. Steve?
Well, and we should never extrapolate that we are powerless against these demons. It's yes, they tempt, but it's our own lust that gets us there. And the gates of hell can never prevail against the gates of the church.
That's correct.
We have the choice.
And to the extent that there may be something akin to demon possession today, the scriptures make it clear that it's because you invited them in. You made enough choices that led you down a dark enough road that eventually you kind of let, as Paul says in Romans, God just says, you know what, go do what you're going to do. And at that point, your spiritual defenses are pretty well gone. And if there is such a thing as demon possession, it's probably the opposite of the Holy Spirit's indwelling of us, where we welcome the Spirit in and we do things to nourish it and build it up. Someone who's never been a part of that chooses to consistently do evil things. Eventually you're welcoming Satan into your life, even if he's not going to literally run the show. I mean, the Spirit doesn't literally run the show for us either. We don't wander around with the Spirit running and talking and doing things. I think modern day demon possession, if we wanted to use that kind of a term, would be someone whose life has been handed over to Satan to the extent that their choices are all directed in that direction. So when we look at this idea of angels who fall, whether it's in Jude, sorry, I went back too far, whether it's in Jude not keeping their proper domain, or it's in Peter where he says they sinned, either way, this idea, they both say the same thing here. They've been kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day, or committed in the pits of darkness reserved for judgment. Nevertheless, we know that there are evil forces that are operating in the world, and that whether it's the same ones as that first group of angels that rebelled when whatever we read in Revelation, or whether it's something else, that there are those who can fall. And the critical point here is, and I think this is where we really need to kind of hang our hat from a scholastic standpoint, is it is less important for us to understand exactly what Jude is talking about in the sense of the events that he's referring to than it is to understand the application that he's making to us. And that is oftentimes true. When you run across a metaphor, for example, a metaphor is fun, but if you run a metaphor too far into the ground, eventually it falls apart. And if you spend all your time talking about the metaphor, you can lose sight of the truth that's being told. And in this case, the metaphor, or not the metaphor, but the example that's being given may not be something that we have direct knowledge of. But the point of it is pretty critical, because angels were created to serve God. Angels are created to be God's messengers. And yet, Jude and Peter both say they can fall. They can rebel. And when they do, the consequence is not, oh, hey, you know what, we'll work it out, come on back. The consequence is we go into judgment and we don't get a second chance. And so when we fall, we don't have the ability to assume that everything's going to be okay just because we were chosen and we were baptized and we were saved once. There is the possibility of losing that if we choose and we keep choosing not to do what God wants. That's the important message out of this. And so rather than getting hung up on what these angels are and everything else, I want to make the point that I think that Jude is trying to make, which is angels can fall, you can fall. I don't think you can. That's really what he's saying. Sodom and Gomorrah is talking about, now Sodom and Gomorrah is not a situation where they were such great people that they fell. They were pretty loud. From the first time we're ever introduced to them, it's pretty clear Sodom and Gomorrah is not the place you want to be if you're a moral person. But the point there that he's making is the destruction that happens. When you sin, there is a consequence. Maybe not right away, but eventually there is a consequence. And in this case, the consequence that Sodom and Gomorrah faced was associated with their physical outward deeds, their sensuality. When you go and you look at all the things that God says Sodom and Gomorrah have been doing, it's not just homosexuality. You get hung up on that one. And certainly that's not irrelevant, but it's not the only issue. When you look in the scriptures, we see that they were murderous. They were I'm trying to think some of the other ones. They were violent. They were abusive. They were a lot of other things too. Although perhaps most of those were in the pursuit of their satisfaction, of their gratification, whether it's sexual or something else. But again, the point that Jude is making here is we don't have to make it a direct relationship. We don't have to say that everything that they did is what you're doing. The point is that when you're chasing after sensual things, you're chasing after things that make you physically happy, what you are doing is the same kind of thing that Sodom and Gomorrah, the same mistake that they made, prioritizing that over everything else. And the consequence of that, of chasing after those kinds of things, immorality and indulging in strange flesh, is the punishment of eternal fire. This is one of the passages, and Paul certainly talks about this extensively as well, but it's fascinating to me that you get people who say, well, the prohibition against homosexuality in particular, but also against adultery and those kind of things, those were Old Testament things. Those were back when God was mean. And then you go and you look at here, and we see what we see here in Jude, we see it over in a number of the writings of Paul, where he's dealing directly with people who have a Greek or Gentile background. He is regularly reminding them that, no, it's not. Okay, it's not just a cultural thing. It isn't just back when God was mean. It's the same God all the time anyway. But the fact is that the expectations of sexual purity and sexual behavior transcend the old law and have been carried forward into the new law because they are about the way that things are supposed to be. In the case of adultery and in the case of fornication, they have to do with covenant laws. In the case of homosexuality, they have to do with the created order, as Paul uses the phrase. And so you can't simply ignore those expectations and expect to be okay just because God has instituted grace and the old law has gone away. Those expectations still exist. And we got to be careful about how we teach that so that we don't unnecessarily antagonize people. There are churches, there are organizations who have ways of teaching about homosexuality that basically makes them pariahs among the people, among the nations, because of how awful they present it or the language that they use. Although I can sympathize with them a little bit in the sense that they're trying to highlight how bad it is in a society that doesn't believe it's bad. And so sometimes harsh language is the easiest way we can come up with that, just like sometimes swearing is the quickest way to get people's attention. That doesn't mean it's okay. It doesn't mean it's useful. So we need to be careful about how we use the concepts and how we teach it, but we also have to be unyielding on the idea that God does have expectations for how people are going to behave sexually and in general in terms of morality, and that we are not going to apologize for what we believe, and we're not going to shortchange what we believe or backpedal what we believe simply because it might mean that somebody doesn't want to be associated with us.
Well, see, that's what we do though. People, we rate sin.
Yes.
We rate it.
Absolutely.
And I could go into a diatribe on comparing homosexuality to some of the other things that are very acceptable in our society, and I'll just name one, which is abortion.
Yes.
Okay, so we seem to struggle with those kind of things, but I don't think God ever views it that way. He says you have sinned, you have a stain, no matter how you got it. Whether it's on your list up here or on your list way down here,
right.
The list includes everything that will keep you from me.
Right.
And so I'm going to provide a pathway back to me.
Yeah.
And so we have a tendency to overlook all the little
right.
things that just don't seem to, we call them white lies, or we call them,
minor transgressions.
sins of passion.
Mistakes. We call them mistakes sometimes. That's a good one. Mistakes.
Yeah,
Mistakes.
and so we do that. We rationalize how severe we are.
That's true. And if that were right, Paul would not have had to say, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Because there really be many, a number of people have sinned, and most have just kind of made minor mistakes, you know. But all have sinned. That can't be true unless some very small things are sins, because there have been some people throughout history who tried really hard not to get anything wrong, you know, and have done their very best not to get anything wrong, and yet Paul says, you still got something wrong, you know. And so, yeah, the triviality of it. Now, when we look at the scriptures, one of the things that we see kind of emerging is this idea that there's a difference between a sin and a course change. That a sin is something that's pretty easy to get back up from and keep on going. That a sin, you know, the recognition, I messed this up, I get up, I ask for forgiveness, maybe I don't even realize I sinned, but I keep marching on the path. I'm headed towards God, I'm following God's lead, and I stumble when I fell down. There's that, and then there's, they've turned away. And most of the time in the scriptures, when we see discipline, for example, in churches needing to be imposed, it's because somebody has turned away. The example that Paul gives in Corinthians isn't that there's this guy who committed adultery one time, you need to kick him out of the church. What is the example? What does Paul say? Who is it Paul says you have to kick out of the church? You guys know what I mean?
You should kick out of the church.
Yeah, who does Paul say in Corinthians that you guys, he specifically says that there's somebody in your church who's doing this thing, get them out. He's literally living with and having relations with his mother-in-law, or his stepmother, probably actually, stepmother, not mother-in-law. And Paul says, you think this is good because you think about you're being really, you know, you're being really graceful and liberal and forgiving. And this is awful. You shouldn't let this go on. Get that person out of there until they realize how bad this is, and then they can come back. So what he's talking about there is somebody who's on a course that is wrong. Not just someone who has stumbled. We stumble, we get up. James says, you know, you see a brother who sinned, you go and let him know, and you restore him, you know. Again, that's not so much someone who, you know, you saw them come out of a bar, you know, well, they've sinned, I've got to go get them back on the good course. Well, maybe if you see them come out of the bar and you know, when you talk to them, you find out that they're drinking regularly and they're drunk regularly, then you have a conversation that's a little more awkward. But initially, at least, it's a stumble, and we don't worry so much about that as long as people are getting and staying on the path. But when we choose to change course and engage in conduct as a course of conduct that is sinful, whether it's these extreme kinds of sins here, or whether it's a much more minor kind of thing, someone who just seems to be lying about everything all the time, using poor language on a regular basis, or, you know, engaging in kind of in behaviors that are a part of a pattern, a consistent set of behaviors, then we have a problem that we really have to start worrying about and dealing with. And I'm not saying that individual sins aren't concerning, that we shouldn't, when we see people doing that, we shouldn't make sure that we understand what's going on, because an individual sin may be indicative of a larger problem. You know, since most of us try not to do bad things in front of people who know us, if we do, that oftentimes suggests either we've got bad luck, or just as likely that we do it often and it's just this is the one time we caught them. It's kind of like with DUIs we used to talk about, the percentage of DUIs we actually catch, even after all the things that we've done with Mothers Against Drunk Driving and everything else, is probably less than 10% of the actual DUIs on the road. And on the one hand, that has a pretty strong deterrent effect, but on the other hand, that's still a lot of people driving drunks out there, you know, and we only catch a few of them because most of the ones who drive drunk don't do anything that we notice, you know, don't do anything real obvious. And that's good for society in the sense that people aren't getting run over, but it's not so good in the sense that they're still thinking that that behavior is normal, okay? So we gotta be careful about that. Okay, we gotta stop here. We're gonna pick up next week talking about this idea of sin and how it affects us, and how righteous people can deal with sin, because Peter will go on to talk about righteous Lot, which is not a, frankly, an adjective I oftentimes associate with Lot given his decision making, but Peter says he is, and Peter's inspired, so I got to go with his ideas. All right, thank you guys.